Welcome to Act Now. I'm Julianna Forlano. Check it. It is the 10-year anniversary of the Occupy Wall Street movement. And we're going to bring you some live coverage from Zuccotti Park in New York City, where today activists are marking the day. We have a great show for you. So we're going live there in about an hour. We actually have it live on the camera. Albert is live in the field with us now, but at 3 p.m., host Messiah Rhodes of act.tv's Black Power Magic Hour will be live in the park. But see, look, we're live in the park right now. There they are. Isn't that great? I love it. It's great to see folks out on the scene. And there was a press conference earlier, and there's something else happening tonight. We're going to bring it all to you here on act.tv. Again, Messiah of the Black Power Magic Hour here on act.tv is going to be talking to the activists on the scene. And you may even see act.tv's Kelly Daly there. We're throwing the whole staff at this thing. Anyway, we have, before we get there, straight up live stream with man on the street to talk to folks. We have a great show for you right here. Our guests, we have a bunch of guests coming on live. We also have guest commentary. We spoke with NOAM CHOMSKY and Marianne Williamson. We're going to be speaking live to the author and co-founding editor of the Occupied Wall Street Journal, Michael Leviton, whose recent book, Generation Occupy, reveals the lasting impacts of the Occupy movement on American politics and culture. And there are many of those, lest you believe what mainstream media says or doesn't say. And first, but definitely not least, James from the internet, host of Left on act.tv, is also joining us. He is an OG of the live stream movement that has been absolutely crucial in activism. And James left CNN a real job to do it. So we're excited to have him joining us in a moment. But first, we're going to set the tone off with this great short video about Occupy Wall Street from Zuccotti Park, obviously filmed back on the original encampment. It is called Nobody Can Predict the Moment of Revolution. We were given permission to show it by the filmmakers Eva Radivojevic and Martina Sarosta. Here it is.
I see corporatism, fascism, crony capitalism. I don't see a free market. I see a police state. I see an American empire. I see 700 military bases in 135 foreign countries. I see 5,000 dead bodies in Iraq. A welfare warfare state which gives out billions of dollars in foreign aid for dictators to build up huge armies. I see America that's lost its way. Republicans and Democrats who both pretty much stand for the same thing. I do not see true democracy. I do not hear the voice of the people. Finally, we've risen up.
Spain, Egypt, is the dynamics, is the time right? Is it the right moment? Is the zeitgeist there? None of these things we can predict.
Hey, sir.
We've seen what happens when people protest and come out and march around for a day. This is an opportunity maybe for a new style, for a new shift in power and the way that people relate to each other. And, like I say, I think we're fucked either way, but it's worth a shot.
I was waiting for this to happen. I knew it would happen because it happened in Europe, and I knew it would spread.
This is something that I've been going through eternally for a good part of my life now, and to see it externalized in the outside world is really a blessing. It's really something that I enjoy being a part of.
I'm an old-timer, so I've been around for 4 decades at one kind of activism or another, and it's always been a hope to go after Wall Street and attack it without getting locked up and beaten up and physically beaten up, and how do we win?
Oh yeah, we're not going anywhere, oh yeah, we're not going anywhere,
It's the process of educating people and educating the world, really, that we have to be first and foremost altruistic and care for the collective before caring for ourselves. A model should be a growing movement of I would say roundtable discussions, basically.
I was arrested
2 days ago.
Interrogated
Interrogated
by police investigators
by police investigators
and intelligence. I encourage everyone who is arrested to not speak to these people. They intimidated me. Said I would be chained to a wall. For a week. If I didn't talk. I didn't talk. I'm here right now.
The mayor of New York has a strange position to be in here. He can't go off looking like Mubarak or some other Middle Eastern leaders and treat protesters the same way they do. And he himself made a comment that if they don't find some jobs for kids, they're going to have a problem like they had in Tunisia and Egypt and other Middle Eastern countries.
The only way that people like us with no power or no money can at least try to change things is through social pressure.
I don't know how to achieve collective liberation, in which we're all striving for, but I mean, I think it all needs to happen at the same time. And you know, we're here making a stand, we're holding space.
To make people conscious, because people are in their houses, comfortable, as long as they have food or they have a house, they don't make the effort to demand their rights.
And it's about time that people start standing up for a true democracy, so we can get rid of the corporate greed.
Demands are problematic and disempowering, actually.
Because it's about people making things happen rather than expecting someone else to take care. And you could see this as a micro society.
It's a model for a new society. It's not a protest in the sense of being against something. It's a way to formulate something new.
A mass awareness, a mass realization, an awakening of the masses to the obstruction of justice that has been a part of our lives for too long now, for too long of a time.
Even though we're so close together, especially in a city like this, and everybody's sort of scared to make that first step, to break through those walls that people put up, to make the connections necessary to build a community like this or different that talks about problems. And we all have common problems, common things that we can change to make our lives better.
I'm a 60-year-old Vietnam-era vet who's been working irregular hours for a lawyer. And the lawyer himself is having financial problems, and he's getting ready to not have me work for him anymore, and I'm in trouble. I don't know what the hell I'm going to do.
If you're frustrated, if you're like me and you see the Tea Party on television and in the news all the time, and you wonder why the hell isn't there a radical left answer to the Tea Party, you should be here. If you have a ton of student debt like me, you should be here. If you're pissed off and you realize that if you paid any taxes last year, you paid more taxes than General Electric, the corporation, you should be here. If you want to see something amazing, period, you should be here.
That was a great piece. Again, our thanks to the filmmakers, Eva Redivojevic and Martina Starosta. They were an important part of the Occupy movement. I'm just so grateful to be able to, look back at that time. First of all, it's like, oh, it was before Trump, like a whole nother world. And I really loved what was said in that video about how it's not just a protest. It was a model of a new society, and the things that were going on there were, people getting involved, people connecting, people taking action was wonderful. And of course, nobody would have seen any of it without live streaming, integral to Occupy Wall Street and to any other movement we've seen since then. I mean, I don't have to go into how live streaming has spread the voices of people who are seeking justice far wider than if they had just had to go through mainstream media channels. Anyway, my friend and colleague James from the internet is going to join us in just a minute, but to jog our memory about where we were historically when Occupy Wall Street was happening in terms of the live streaming and media atmosphere, when live streaming burst onto the scene, take a look at this video.
Social media both shared the message and buoyed the fact of the Arab Spring. There was an immediate jump around that point, around spring 2011, for the mainstream media to talk about the Arab Spring as a Twitter revolution, which I think pointed to the fact of the mainstream media missing that it wasn't a Twitter revolution, it was the use of a tool.
One of the biggest disruptive things that happened in technology was the ability to live stream on phones. Initially during Arab Spring, and then subsequent protests in Europe that summer, and then eventually kicking off Occupy Wall Street. This obviously made our authorities kind of freak the hell out, because a bunch of kids with cameras leading protests all over the place and recording protests became so disruptive that nobody really knew what to do.
Guy, if I'm remembering correctly. We're going to have James on in just a moment. Oh, there you are. Hello, James. Welcome to the anniversary of Occupy Wall Street. Oh,
sorry about that.
Oh, there you go.
How are you? Yeah, no,
okay.
that was a trip. Yeah, Joe, Natasha, John. It's thank you. I didn't feel old when I woke up this morning as it was. So
It's also our anniversary, our friend-iversary.
Our friend-iversary.
Yeah, I think I met you at Occupy or some Occupy adjacent event. But
it's probably S17.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. Yeah.
It was the first S17 I came up.
Is that what happened?
Yeah. That was when I met a lot of people, was because remember I started off in Atlanta, whereas most of the people, especially in act.tv, who have ties there were, either New York or DC. So I got my start in Atlanta, and I took like an 18-hour bus up for the first anniversary on S17, and that was where I met a lot of the New York people, the people in the OWS media, Joe, the people at Global Revolution. That was wild.
Well, James, you were in Atlanta because you were working for CNN, yes, and you left CNN for the live streaming world.
Well, to be fair, I was working on Dancing with the Stars and I was producing Nancy Grace.
Okay.
Working in the CNN building.
That's terrible. Yes. Wow, you've come a long way, my friend. You've come a long way. Can you talk a little bit? We're seeing you're seeing right next to us on screen a live stream of the park where it all went down, at least in New York, the Zuccotti Park, and some of the activists that are celebrating there today. There's a couple events going on throughout the day, one again coming up at 5 o'clock. Can you talk about the significance that live streaming had for the reach of Occupy and for the movement of Occupy?
I mean, the probably like the earliest thing and the biggest endorsement I can throw out there, and I'll be frank here, is so I was pretty much what I guess what the kids would now call a normie or a chud forever. I was Joe Sixpack. I had a job. I didn't like it. I was, generally pissed off. I worked my 9 to 5. I came home. I cable TV. I ate my Happy Meal. I was your typical generic American. And for through social media, every once in a while, I started getting random videos and live streams that pop up in my Facebook feed. You know, this is like 11 years ago. And it would be like a random video from Occupy Wall Street, like a live stream from in the park, or people who had like cell phone live streams from Tahrir Square in the Arab Spring, stuff like that. And that would occasionally find its way into my social media, which up until then was all like, you know, football stories and memes. And the next thing I knew, like I was watching live streams like 8 hours a night. Like I would get home from work and instead of watching TV, like I started like you had to go and find these people. Like it wasn't obvious and easy. And I had to find all these live streams and all these different platforms. And literally the next thing I knew, like instead of watching TV, I was watching live streams. And that is what eventually like got me to go down to a park one day and be like, yo, y'all, I work in TV and this is like wild shit. And like somebody came over and like put a laptop in my hand. They're like, here you go, you're the live streamer. And they walked away and I was like, literally, that's how all of this started. It is
such an, I mean, the woman in the first video said that it was not just a protest. Again, it was a lovely quote. It's a model of a new society. And your story shows that it's a model of a new society. Oh, you know how to run this camera? Then do it. You don't have to show me your college degree. You don't have to, you know, it was just like, you're in charge of the media, not in charge, but like, we need you to help out with the media right now. And I think that giving of power to the people and actually having people run with the power is what incited the state to crack down so hard.
Well, I mean, I know when we got evicted in Atlanta was the same time when the large eviction happened in Zuccotti. And if you remember, the eviction, the way it unfolded was there were evictions done in like some 30 some odd occupations, like across a whole bunch of states. And afterwards, shockingly, and I know this is a stunner for you too, Juliana, but shocked when I found out that like all the governors got on like a group phone call.
Yeah.
I was like, we have all these people who are just like sitting like in the middle of parks, not doing anything, and we want to get rid of them. And even like the libertarians are like, it's public space. Yeah. And they were like freaked out for months. And then finally one night they were like, F it, let's just go in and beat the crap out of all of them and evict everybody at once. Just we'll eat the shit storm for a week. We'll be fine. And like, that was like a huge flex. That was for people who had never been in, like, especially for me, like I wasn't a lifelong, you know, protester or anything of that ilk. So for me, it was wild.
And you're not from, you know, a community of color who gets over policed. So you're just not used to that state repression being right at your doorstep all the time.
No. But like I got to the point where I, you know, the running joke is always, oh, the police are after me. Oh, people are following me. It's the black sedans. Like once I actually saw the black sedans and I nudged somebody next to me and I was like, that's like one of those black sedans, right? And they're like, oh no, you're not seeing things. I was like, oh, okay, that's what the black sedan looks like. Like the whole thing became very surreal very quickly.
Yeah, we have so Messiah Rhodes, you know him obviously because we're all part of the ActTV team here. Messiah Rhodes, he hosts the Black Power Magic Hour on our YouTube channel. He did a documentary, and I have a piece of it. It's called State of Revolution, a 2011 visual retrospective of activism in New York. He really captures some of the police violence that went on through Occupy. I mean, sometimes when you're like live streaming and what people see is not necessarily the violence. They're seeing the drum circle, they're seeing the call and response. But I think unfortunately, it was the violence that helped make the news. Anyway, let's take a look and then we'll discuss.
Now, New York's Occupy Wall Street demonstrations are spreading far beyond the US. Protesters are holding a day of coordinated action in cities across the world.
We are Troy Davis! We are Troy Davis! We are Troy Davis!
His conviction solely wrapped on eyewitness testimony. 7 out of the 9 witnesses have recanted in sworn affidavits. How many have recanted?
7!
How many?
7!
How many?
7!
How many?
7!
They have said they will execute him anyway tomorrow at 7. We say no
Troy Davis.
I am
Troy Davis.
I am
Troy Davis.
I am
It was also day 5 of a thing called Occupy Wall Street. A handful of people camping out a park was in the corner of my lens. I came back 2 days later.
My mom has a master's degree and a college degree. And what did they do? They took their home. I will go to jail tonight because it's not right. And I'm not. Tell it. I'm not. Tell it. I will not. Tell it. Stand by.
Guys, look out. You gotta move, please.
And just what?
Sorry, you need medical attention. You gotta move. Mental check.
We're not going. Because we are against the system.
Because we are against the system.
That does not provide.
That does not provide.
Free education.
Free education.
Free healthcare.
Free healthcare.
Free housing.
Free housing.
Free treatment for all who need it.
Free treatment for all who need it.
What's your name? You guys have bigger fish. Oh, really? Get that. Get that. Get that. Get that. Like, really? Really? Why on the floor? Why on the floor? Why are you putting him on the floor? What's the whole point? What's the whole point? Watch out. Watch out. Watch out.
Look, he just arrested that man for no reason.
Calm down! What are you guys doing?
Back off.
Come on! What are you guys doing? No! Wow! Whoa! Guys! Everybody's watching. Everybody's watching.
You don't give a fuck.
Oh, you don't care? And we're here to say that there is an alternative to that. That we are contributing to. Right here and now. People's Mic. Join us at Liberty Plaza. Help occupy Wall Street.
the world.
People around the world.
People who want a better life.
People who want a better life.
It starts here.
It starts here.
It starts now.
It starts now.
Who would like to speak next?
Oh, man. Oh, that was thanks to Messiah Rhodes of Black Power Magic Hour. That was the State of Revolution, a 2011 visual retrospective of activism in New York. I will try not to fall off of my thing here next time. We're speaking with James from the internet. James, what'd you think of that? What did it bring up for you?
Well, number one, it's the more things change, the more things stay the same. Unsurprisingly, the NYPD has not gotten any less heavy-handed in the last decade. Thankfully, there are more people with more cameras and more outlets to put that footage out to. So this sort of thing, like I remember in 2010, 2011, 2012, seeing the footage and being involved in it, I was blown away because this was like not my norm after decades on the planet. Now people see it as a norm. This is a topic of conversation. This is a topic of potential legislation. 10 years ago, nobody was talking about police violence. You know, Amadou Diallo got swept under the rug. The occupation in Atlanta, to that video, we literally renamed the park in downtown Atlanta Troy Davis Park, just to force the media to say the name Troy Davis over and over again. So it's a lot of stuff, but yeah, I feel old and tired now.
Well, good thing we have a lot of young people who are who weren't even maybe alive and active during Occupy Wall Street, and they're probably alive and only 10, but just kind of coming online politically in the era of Occupy Wall Street, where all of these other movements have popped up from Occupy Wall Street. We are going to be talking about that with our next guest, Michael Levitin, who'll be on in just a minute. But James, former journalist and live streamer, who makes daily YouTube videos for our very own channel on act.tv, discussing news and politics and economics from a left perspective. Also, you can find James on the Twitch, not the Twitter. There's a whole story there, right, James? The whole story about not being on the Twitter. We won't get into it today, but on the Twitch, James from the One Internet. The one stands in for the I. There's a whole thing. He'll explain it to you. James, what would you say to people who are watching, who are looking back at the Occupy Wall Street movement today, people who may have been involved? What would your final parting thoughts be?
Definitely sort of celebrate it and enjoy, the camaraderie and that aspect of it. But take like the lessons and the tools that we learned from there, the stuff that's gone on to, help people around the country donate to survivors from Sandy during Occupy Sandy, to, mobilize small local networks across the country that were involved in getting media and supplies to the No KXL pipeline protesters and the No DAPL protesters, the independent media who's out there now covering Black Lives Matter protests. And all of this, none of it is thanks to Occupy, but all of the people doing this is where they discovered those tools and honed those tools. So if you're a former OWS person or you're still in a movement today, keep evolving the technology and what you do and how you do it, because the longer you stay one step ahead, the longer this it has a lot more effect, and we have a chance to actually move the needle when people are out there.
And also thank you for everything that's already been done. Sometimes I walk through the airport and they have like a lounge for people who fought in combat. And I'm like, we need a lounge for people who take to the streets and protest and do all the thankless work that we do from the bottom of our hearts. So thanks a lot, James. I appreciate it. Everyone, please watch James's stuff on act.tv. It is off the hook. I appreciate you, James.
I appreciate you, Juliana.
All right. Hey, check it out. We've got more to come. I had a conversation not long ago with, guess who? Professor Noam Chomsky about the importance of Occupy. And I have it here for you right now. Here it is. Professor, Occupy Wall Street is having its 10-year anniversary this year. In fact, this organization, act.tv, came out of the Occupy movement. Would you comment on that movement, its importance, and any enduring legacy you see?
The Occupy movement was extremely successful. It's always called a failure, but that's a misunderstanding. Occupy was a tactic. It was not a strategy. You can't sit in Zuccotti Park forever. It was a tactic that had enormous success. It shifted discourse and thinking radically. It brought into the center of public attention for the first time the critical issue of radical inequality. Late David Graeber's slogan, "We're the 99%. That resonated, and it made a big difference all across the board. Changed what's sometimes called the Overton window, what you can talk about. Now, the Occupy movement tried hard to move on to other kinds of activities, neighborhood organizing and so on. Some success, some failure, but there was a lasting impact. You're one example of it, many others. Okay, so I would say that's one of the more successful movements in modern American history. Changed things enormously. The tactic, of course, couldn't go on forever. It was a short-term tactic, which it also introduced concepts of solidarity and mutual support, which was a major breakthrough in changing understanding and consciousness. We can work together. We can have our own soup kitchens. We can support each other. Okay? That's a very important understanding in a society where the doctrinal system is working overtime to convince you that you have to be out for yourself and not pay attention to anyone else. That's what we're indoctrinated in from childhood. So just breaking through and saying, no, that's not true. We can work together for the common good, big effect and a lasting effect. So I'd say it was a very successful movement.
Professor Chomsky, I thank you so much for being on the program. Thank you for all the work you have done in the name of peace and justice. I encourage everyone to go out and get the new book, Chomsky for Activists. Not only is Professor Chomsky interviewed in there and has pieces written, but there are other activists who have worked with Professor Chomsky throughout the years talking about their experience. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for what you're doing. It's crucial.
You're watching act.tv. Noam Chomsky said what we were doing is crucial. I have to say, that was one of the highlights of my whole entire life. Just the whole interview with Noam Chomsky that I was able to do. And that when he said that, I got to tell you, yeah, it's been very reinvigorating to have had that conversation and also to be celebrating and looking back to Occupy and to see how far we've come and how much people on the left have actually accomplished. I also got a chance to speak with Marianne Williamson. She is a former presidential candidate who you may remember mentioned from the stage that we should have love and a Department of Peace instead of a Department of War, also known as the DOD. She said other things that are highly unusual coming off of that stage. And I was grateful to be able to talk to her. She did speak at the Occupy LA, and she was part of Occupy LA while that encampment was going on. Here's Marianne. I spoke to her a couple days ago. Marianne, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm always happy to talk to you.
You would be considered a spiritual leader for many people in the country, including many people who heard you speak at Occupy Wall Street, LA. Can you talk about what your experience was at that point in time? Were you surprised that this movement sprung up?
No, I wasn't surprised, but I was happy. I think Occupy Wall Street performed a great service for this country, harnessed a lot of energy, really took into the mainstream the very simple but very true, but before that point in many ways obscured the idea that the vast majority of the resources in this country are in the hands of 1%. I don't think that that had totally clicked in the popular mind until Occupy. And there was so much pent up energy because of people who knew, but they didn't quite know. It was kind of inchoate. Some people absolutely knew, but they didn't feel permission to really shout it from the rooftops. Other people didn't know why all the suffering that didn't seem to come from someplace they could identify. It was like, yes. So I was and I remain a great fan.
People with your level of prominence who went to speak at the encampments. Michael Moore was at Zuccotti Park. Others were at the different encampments. Can you talk a little bit about what drew you to just be present with your physical body in the square?
I was raised. My father used to say, "Don't let the bastards get to you, little sister." Too many people get sucked into this faux sophistication, this pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-sophisticated elite perspective, whereby once they get to a certain position in terms of prominence or prestige or money, they no longer say what they know to be true in the same way. And I think the point where you have any level of platform, public audience, is when you have a sort of moral responsibility to say it louder. That's not when you should start whispering about what you know to be true. That's when you should take advantage of the fact that some people are listening and make sure you shout it from the rooftops.
All right. Wasn't that wonderful? We have a much longer piece from Marianne that we'll be showing later today on our YouTube page and within the context of the Act Now show over the next week. So please tune in there. Very grateful to have had that conversation. I hope you're enjoying this show as much as we enjoyed putting it all together. The team at act.tv, which by the way, act.tv sprung out of the Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street movement. So we're very grateful to the movement. I'm grateful for everyone who's on this team at act.tv. And I really do want to say thank you to everyone who watches, everyone who feels we're doing a service. And we hope you will stay with us. Coming up next, I have an interview planned with Michael Leviton. He's here in the back room of the Zoom. His new book, Generation Occupy: Reawakening American Democracy, talks about just how Occupy reshaped American culture and redefined economic rights and progressive politics for an activism for a generation. I look forward to having that conversation in just a minute. From the fight for a $15 minimum wage to the nationwide teacher strikes, from Bernie to AOC, from Black Lives Matter to Me Too, Generation Occupy, the book by our next guest, Michael Leviton, reveals the lasting impacts of the Occupy movement on the American politics and culture. Michael Leviton joining us right now, journalist, former occupier, co-founding editor of the Occupied Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Juliana. It's such a great compilation and sort of remembering of Occupy, watching the show that you've all put together. It's been really something.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And the book that you put together, how timely. Did you plan this? No. It's wonderful. There's been a lot of there's always the conversation for Occupy Wall Street didn't do anything. Occupy Wall Street didn't achieve anything, but your book talks about how basically Occupy Wall Street reshaped American culture. Can you give us a little bit of a window into that premise?
I think that, yeah, I mean, that's really it. I have been thinking about it, as I know you and many of your viewers have, for the last 10 years. And it really, I tried to write this story closer to the movement after the movement sort of dissipated and sort of disappeared, but it was still too close and the impacts weren't clear enough. And I wasn't distant enough from it to sort of look at it more analytically and historically, I think what we've seen and what you're showing today with this 10-year sort of a revision, you know, a retrospective, is just the vast distance. It's become clearer watching the trends, the activism, the movements that have sprung up that Occupy helped seed the ground for, from the Bernie movement and AOC and the new progressives that are steering the new Democratic Party message, you know, to the Fight for 15, the labor movement, the Walmart strikes, and you name it. I'd love to talk in more detail. And the climate movement, all of these urgent movements that have defined this past decade, really, the teens, were essential to sort of set the historical record straight. I think that many people, certainly in the Trump era, you know, were sort of kind of ready to write Occupy out of history, in the sense that it really didn't, you know, it had its moment, it flared, it burst out, we moved on, and it left us with the 99% and the 1%, a new vocabulary, a new rhetoric, but what did it really leave behind? That was always, that's how I start the book. What happened to Occupy? For most people, it sort of vanished. For those of us who've really been following the story, it did not vanish. It, on the contrary, was really the birthing ground of this new era of widespread protest and resistance, and a new politics in America, a new labor movement, re-energized, fighting for its own interests and rights. And I felt compelled to tell the story. And yes, the 10-year mark seemed appropriate time. Lucky to bring it out now.
You're so right about how it's too close to do it at the time. I mean, everything had to unfold from there in order to really be able to draw those lines. And I'm really glad you did. Let's talk specifically about the labor movement. We just had a guest on, or we've been covering things from the Bessemer, from the Amazon protesters who wanted to unionize in Bessemer, to the other labor issues that are going on right now, the airline people who are being abused by the industry there. We cover that all the time. Talk about the through line from Occupy to today's labor movement.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. I think this is a completely underreported, under-recognized story. Occupy's profound impact. So we all remember that Occupy, you know, it injected the conversation of inequality, right? It sort of put the crisis of inequality on the map. No one had talked about it. It was all austerity politics. Obama was all about austerity, belt tightening measures across the Atlantic in Brussels and Washington. Occupy hit, of course, following the European movements that which followed the Arab Spring. So it wasn't as though Occupy created it out of thin air, but it took these messages of discontent, democratic and economic discontent felt across the planet, and crystallized it in that simple phrase, the 99% and the 1%. But then, as I say, most people think that it stopped there. You know, 1 year exactly after Zuccotti Park was cleared in November of 2012, the Fight for 15 got launched. Occupy Wall Street veterans, activists had been instrumental and had been on the bottom, on the front lines, helping organize with clergy, with unions, with community organizing groups to get the first several hundred fast food workers mobilized, get their kind of new $15 wage, minimum wage. Unthinkable at that point. Now it practically passed in the coronavirus stimulus bill that was passed in March by Biden and the Democratic Congress. It was almost slipped in there by Bernie and company, but it shows just the degree to which that $15 minimum wage, the low wage worker movement, has changed the conversation. It created the Fight for 15, which led to, you know, nationwide global strikes and protests that have gone on. It also really pushed, and that of course led to more than 30 states raising their minimum wage, not to $15, but across legislatures, voters, anywhere where a raised minimum wage went on the ballot in the years after Occupy, it passed. People were mobilized, and then it translated to other movements like the Walmart worker strikes, I just wanted to say, which ignited at the same time as the Fight for 15. People forget this, the Black Friday strikes, the fact that workers weren't paid a living wage at Walmart and are living off of food stamps and on Medicare when they're working full time. The same moment, a year after Occupy, they used Occupy tactics, the people's mic. They organized, it was like Occupy had delegitimized the 1%, And here you have this new in the next chapter in the inequality debate was actually the organizing of the labor movement by unions that heard the call, and they got a raise. They raised wages for 500,000 workers at the world's largest retailer. That's a concrete result. And then you see it all the way through with the domestic workers, as you said, the airport workers, the supermarket clerks, the adjunct professors, which I formerly was.
Yeah, me too.
And you too. And how many viewers here, right? I mean, it translated across society. It lit that fire, and it's hard to quantify. I think people don't make the connection to Occupy because, you know, it's not Occupy directly responsible, but there wasn't, you know, Ronald Reagan crushed the air traffic controllers workers back in 1981, 10,000, he just fired overnight. It dealt a generational blow to the country's unions, which really have never properly recovered. They haven't. But now for the first time really in decades, workers are demanding, I think we saw in the teacher strikes of 2018, a culmination in red state America. This was West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Arizona. You saw teachers en masse walking out, demanding raises, which they won because they had this new courage and message and demand that would not go silent. We simply didn't have that sort of labor militancy. And I think that Occupy just lit that fire. And we see it, as you say, in the coronavirus time, I think, as well. Look at the new labor economy. People aren't willing to risk their health and lives for a paltry wage and very little secure and safe, you know, working conditions any longer. I think they see that they have power, that the scales are balancing, and Congress, if it can pass this pro-union, the PRO Act, the strongest act for unions in a generation, that would really cement this movement. But I think we've already seen just a dramatic rebalancing of the power.
You know what I think is interesting? I heard an occupier who was in the outreach committee speak earlier today, and she said that one of her jobs was what they decided to do was to go and look up all of what labor was doing in New York City and show up. It's not like labor just said, oh, there's a movement, let's go, we're in this together. It didn't coalesce quite that way. The original occupiers went out to labor movements with signs saying, you are the 99%. And then those labor movements kind of got on board and they became part of the Occupy Wall Street fabric. They got on board quickly as they recognized that the message was, you know, in line with everything that they've been doing this whole time. But it wasn't just a nation marriage of Occupy Wall Street and labor. Occupy Wall Street, the original folks went out and courted other people who were from the working class, who were also being decimated by the structure of our financial system at the time. It's the same pretty much right now. But what are your thoughts about that?
I think that's a great point. I think it took real courage for labor. I think labor did not intuitively see a bunch of anarchists and sort of college educated young 20-year-old white kids, which was how it was framed in the media. And if you went down to Zuccotti Park, you'd see a lot of them there. I don't think that the working rank and file at the start heard the Occupy message speaking right to them. Or if they heard it, yeah, it might make sense, but these guys don't look like us. They certainly don't come from our, you know, we're not cut from the same cloth, and we don't belong there. I think that what Occupy Wall Street, and we covered it at the Occupied Wall Street Journal, I think it was our third edition, really in the heart of the movement as it was just taking off. October 5th, I remember it, I have it in the book. That was this critical day at Foley Square, October 5th, 2011, 2.5 weeks into the movement, when it was supposed to be a student-led kind of march demonstration, and labor decided to lean in. They came out, the unions, the transport workers, the communication workers, you know, healthcare, Nurses United, lots of labor groups. And I remember important labor leaders in the city, Stuart Applebaum with the retail union, and Gershom, and various people who were really key leaders in the city decided at those meetings, as you say, occupiers went out, and Nalini Stamp, real leaders at Occupy who had these connections and ways to meet face to face and bring labor in. But it also, I remember the articles in the New York Times. It was there were real heavy debates. Do we join from labor? Do we join this movement that is essentially calling for an end to capitalism, or for, doesn't want to support any party, or admit that there are leaders in Washington that they need to speak with? They had to come around. I think, though, when they did, it was this revelatory moment. And I profile in the book the Verizon workers, and one in particular who, they're not activists. These aren't rah-rah. These aren't folks who go out in the street, but they saw they had a dog in this fight. And if they're not looking out for themselves, no one will. And once that message sank in, that the 99%, they are it, we are it, I think it initiated this process that we're still seeing play out, where labor is not the same that labor was a decade ago. It's an entirely new footing that it's put itself on.
And I think that the world took more note, and the movement became more of a threat, didn't it? At that point, after that October 5th point, when labor got involved, it became more of a threat, and then we would see more state repression. Is that accurate?
State repression of workers?
Of state repression of the people in the park.
Oh, well, I mean, we certainly, the one moment when labor really was critical was the night of potentially greatest repression, which was the night that Bloomberg sent in his, militarized police to try to, who surrounded the park, but it ended up being the night of greatest triumph of Occupy. Probably the sweetest moment before the bitter fall was that mid-October night when when occupiers defended the park, thanks in part to about a 4:30 a.m. or 5 a.m. arrival of the of workers from the AFL-CIO, who had sanctioned this protest, and they marched down in the middle of the night with Zuccotti filled with all the activists. But here comes organized labor saying, Bloomberg, you're not going to clear this park. We're defending it with the kids. And that was this moment of really pretty magical solidarity. I talked to longshore workers out here in Oakland. I'm in California for this book, and talked to them. There's a lot of mixed feelings. Obviously, the way Occupy Oakland went down, the way that Occupy really wasn't, in the long run, able to really communicate with labor very well. They didn't do a real, let's sit down and talk about how we can work together. Occupy, in its brashness and its immediacy and aggressive, militant tactics, sort of just went ahead and did what it was going to do and hoped that people like labor would follow, like in the port shutdown that happened across the Western ports. And the longshoremen and the unions really left with pretty mixed feelings about Occupy and decentralized horizontal organizing efforts and all of that. There could have been really more room that Occupy had different forms of leadership and structure, could have possibly really kind of recruited and brought labor and maybe created some kind of alliance that would have helped the movement last longer. It didn't, but
but we're still here today doing things. The movementarians, as they're called. Michael Levitin, can you talk about, I know we're almost at the top of the show, and I can see my producer. I'm looking to see if he's giving me he gave me the okay. If you don't mind, because one of the most pressing parts of our what we're fighting against, what activists are fighting against, is climate change. And you talked about in the book the roots of some of the climate activism we're seeing today being in Occupy. Can you draw those lines for us, please?
I really, this was the part that helped me sell this book to the publisher in the first place. It was my sample chapter. I was riveted. I mean, I think that this trajectory of Occupy to the Green New Deal, it's fascinating. It's beautiful. It shows not only the character who drives my narrative and the Occupy Climate chapter in the book, who is Evan Weber, a co-founder of the Sunrise Movement. I mean, he is literally kind of an embodiment of the way that Occupy evolved into our modern climate movement. He was 20 years old as a college student at Wesleyan, I believe, who came down to Zuccotti and marched on the first day of the march, came with, a busload of several dozen college students, made it all the way to the Trump building. On day one of Occupy, he was a kid. He was one of the millennial, one of the young ones and he was right out in front. But his trajectory and how it shows of him going deep into the climate movement and ultimately helping co-found the Sunrise Movement, which today is the most vocal and really effective youth, it's the Gen Z, it is really the face of the new climate movement. They learned so much from Occupy. I think what I learned in reporting this book and the climate section, occupiers went straight into the climate message. After Occupy dissipated, it's like they redirected the fight against inequality into the fight to save our planet. They translated that message of a broad us, 99% versus a narrow them, the 1%. They made the narrow them the fossil fuel executives of the 1%, the lobbyists, the CEOs and shareholders who are strangling our planet and obstructing clean energy and progress for their short-term shareholder gain. They use that language and rhetoric, and you see it. And I show this trajectory of right after Occupy ended. I mean, you got the student divestment movement, which started on college campuses. Students needed something to do when they were energized by Occupy in 2011 and 2012. They started this movement that blew up like wildfire. Look at how it's a $15 trillion movement globally today of fossil fuel divestments from huge portfolios, BlackRock and all the rest. That started out of Bill McKibben and a handful of small, college campuses launching this movement, but it used this radical tactics and energy of Occupy in more organized ways. The fossil fuel resistance that shut down one project after the next in the Pacific Northwest, coal export terminals, gas export terminals, coal trains, oil trains, you name it, they just went down, falling like dominoes, literally, because activists got lit and they had legal arguments behind them. They translated that energy and commitment to Occupy. They translated into the climate movement. They in a sense created the new climate movement, which really didn't exist until Occupy fused with what was at that point the Keystone XL fight. That amounted to the climate movement, and that Keystone fight evolved, that succeeded. They shut down Keystone, but it evolved into Standing Rock, right? Into a 10-month occupation of people driving across the country. AOC got her start at Standing Rock by going there and standing in solidarity with the Sioux reservation, the Sioux people on their land, and as water protectors. And then it translated into my goodness, the global climate strikes and Greta Thunberg. Obviously, that's not Occupy per se, that's in Europe, but the energy here to mobilize young people, digital natives, Gen Z, walking out by the millions because they heard their generational call of decentralized sort of organizing similar to Occupy, going out, Extinction Rebellion combining with all this. I mean, it's like we have seen, these are dark times. The climate, we're imperiled. The Congress is not moving. It's as bad, it seems, as it, we're close to some major progress, but we're not there. And yet the mobilizing is radically different today. I like to think, because Occupy helped light that fuse, you've got a whole generation that isn't going to be silenced any longer. And look at Extinction Rebellion, direct action taken really out of the Occupy playbook by a lot of the same people from Occupy who are helping lead that movement. I hope it really resurges and combines with the new generation of activists to actually get it done. The final point being Sunrise, they learned from Occupy's mistakes because Occupy did not have structure or policy. It did not want to enter the political process. It was explicit about that. What Evan Weber and the Sunrise folks did is they studied what Occupy got wrong. They went and they actually learned with Occupy Wall Street organizers, some of the best ones who founded Momentum, an organization that went to train young groups of activists, the next generation of activists, to kind of assimilate, to take what they have learned from past movements, from the civil rights era, from the Gandhi, from various civil disobedience movement, apartheid, the color revolutions of Eastern Europe, all Black Lives Matter, Occupy, see what worked, see what didn't. And they used a lot of tactics from Occupy, but then they used political pressure to get candidates elected to drive AOC to announce the Green New Deal. And here we have at the top of the Democratic Party platform in the 2020 election, and now in the congressional $3.5 trillion budget bill, a climate core and hundreds of billions of dollars to invest, if it passes, in climate solutions. So there's progress. Let's acknowledge it.
Michael, you mentioned Extinction Rebellion as one of our coworkers at ActTV was walking down to Zuccotti Park today. She passed, I believe it was the New York Public Library, where there's a huge Extinction Rebellion movement with banners and signs and people there trying to end fossil fuels out in the street as we speak. So it's happening, and I do really appreciate you coming on the program. Final topic, and brief because the show is supposed to be over, but we're keeping going because that's the beauty of not being, curtailed by advertising and having to stop it when we have to play, an ad for Zeltrex or whatever the next thing is. You were one of the co-founding editors of the Occupied Wall Street Journal, and now you are a journalist. You've appeared in the Atlantic, the Guardian, Newsweek, Time, the LA Times, and can you talk a little bit about the state of our media landscape and how that is tied to the Occupy Wall Street movement?
I mean, I think the media has probably really shifted also since I didn't really address that in the book per se, but now that you ask it, I mean, the media.
Add a chapter. Can you put it in the follow-up?
Put it in. I mean, I had a technology section, and actually one of your colleagues there, Harry Weisbrand, was one of the central characters helping drive that narrative of how technology helped Occupy kind of overcome the media barrier. The fact that people at Occupy, and I think you already referred to it a while earlier on the show, figured out how to puncture and get through the media blockade. I think that when Occupy hit 10 years ago today, amazing that we're on this day, it really, the media wasn't capable of hearing that message. It was too abstract. It was too overwhelming, too systemic of an announcement that Occupy was, the verdict that our system was bankrupt in itself, that capitalism and the 1% and inequality, everything needed to be reined in, corporate control of politics. So the media did its best to ignore it. It stood around on the sidelines for 1 week, trying to sort of say these are a motley crew of kids camping in a park, and what do they really have to say, and what are they about? The media did what it typically does, the mainstream media. Occupy, and what we did at the Occupied Wall Street Journal, and what everyone who was part of Occupy, who tweeted and Facebook, you remember social media was kind of newish at that point. Going online and instantly uploading a video from the streets of police brutality, or simply a tweet or a blog, it hadn't been used for activism in America yet. I think it had been used in the Green Revolution in Iran several years earlier, and then of course in the Arab Spring in the winter preceding Occupy. But we in America had never used these new tools, a phone in our pocket with a camera, upload a video, upload a tweet, upload a blog, Facebook, etc., make it viral, blow it up. And I think that the tech activists discovered that as much action as there was going on the ground at Occupy, actually they were bringing in so much more online, creating this sort of virtuous cycle where action on the ground would stimulate real interest online among tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, which would bring more people into the streets, which would create more. It was like it was experimenting in real time with this new tech activism. And I think that bless you. And I think that the media, in a sense, really got the picture that, they missed the ball. They immediately had to correct once the pepper spray cop incident, once Occupy blew up. I think that since Occupy, the mainstream media knows that this new generation isn't waiting for the media to cover the story. They're going to do it themselves anyway. Black Lives Matter.
Here we are.
Here we are. Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, the climate strikes, March for Our Lives. A bunch of 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds walking out of high school in Parkland ignite a nationwide movement that helps dethrone the National Rifle Association finally. And it took a bunch of teenagers doing it on their own without, maybe the media was covering, but it really didn't matter because they did their own media, as the new generation has learned to do. So I think that really we have in our own way transformed media.
Michael Leviton, thank you so much for joining me on the program. And it is nice to see you again. I don't think I've seen you since the lockdown and then years before that. Generation Occupy is the new book. Congratulations on it. Generation Occupy, Reawakening American Democracy. I do suggest everyone go and get it. There were some really wonderful connections that you made there. And it is really a celebration of what's happened. And I found it very hopeful about the fight that we're in on all fronts. So thank you so much for writing it. And thanks for being on our program.
Thank you, Julianna. You guys are doing great work. Love that you're keeping it going and building the next let's bring on the 20s.
Let's bring on the 20s. Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
You are watching actNOW. This is actNOW, where we cover the progressive movement. We cover things that are happening on the ground. Most of the stuff that you're not going to see on mainstream media. I feel like everyone says, oh, you're not going to hear this on mainstream media. But this is stuff you're really not going to see on mainstream media because it doesn't even fit some we're crazy narrative. It is the movement. So we thank you so much for watching. I thank everyone who was part of the Occupy movement and who takes any kind of action, whether it's sharing this with people who might want to learn about their history or being on the front lines of whatever movement they are in. Just thank you for all the work that you are doing. I'm Julianna Forlano. You can follow me on Twitter, follow actTV, please, across platforms. We are growing and growing and growing, and it is all thanks to you. I will see you next week. Have a great weekend.